Brexit demonstrators aren't the only protesters here in Westminster this week, as the political temperature shows no sign of dropping. Everything to do with duty of sincere cooperation will be in the toilet. Ireland's Prime Minister has gone back on his word. Countries that give us an extension will go to the back of the queue. The words of a Downing Street source sent in a long text message.
Some in Downing Street now think talks with Europe are going to break down in the next few days. They will try and blame Europe for that.
Is this deal a sham?
One former cabinet minister pointed the finger at the Prime Minister's special advisor, Dominic Cummings.
It sounds angry and desperate. I do not believe should be the language of a UK government.
Westminster was still digesting the import of the Downing Street text when Number 10 served up a second helping.
Number 10 are saying pretty clearly that Mrs Merkel made it clear that there was overwhelmingly no chance of an agreement.
What's at stake is not winning some stupid blame game, said the President of the EU Council, Donald Tusk.
It's going to be very difficult to secure an agreement by next week, quite frankly.
If there is no deal, what happens then? MPs will gather in the Commons after the summit on October the 19th, a Saturday.
I'm ready to hang out. Yeah,
Look at that! Boris is hanging out!
The US businesswoman to whom Boris Johnson is accused of providing special favours, while London Mayor broke her silence.
It's really categorically no one's business what private life we had.
Stronger by the hour!
Campaigners who think the real crisis is not Brexit, but climate change, brought much of Westminster to a standstill.
Uncooperative crusties and protesters of all kinds littering the road.
I'll be speaking to one of those campaigners and to former Prime Minister Tony Blair about why he wants another referendum and not a general election. Good evening. Welcome to Westminster, where tribal demonstrations are all the rage. The streets around Parliament are awash with Remainers, Leavers and now eco-warriors. They're all pretty certain what they want. The rest of us, not so much. A new study of the British electorate reports that 50% of us are now floating voters. The political parties have never been less sure how we will vote, which perhaps explains why our politicians are suddenly shy of the ballot box, be it Labour's reluctance to vote for a general election or the Tories' refusal to countenance a second referendum. As long-established political tribes dissolve and new ones are yet to be formed, elections are a bigger gamble than ever. And if that helps to keep the political class on its toes, then perhaps that's just how it should be. As never before, they cannot take our votes for granted. Now, a little while ago, I spoke to the man who did pretty well at the ballot box as Labour leader, Tony Blair. Tony Blair, if there's no deal, and that looks more likely by the hour, the Benn Act kicks in 10 days from now. It forces the government to ask Brussels for a Brexit delay beyond October the 31st. Is that act robust enough to ensure that happens?
I think so. I mean, I'm not an expert on the constitutional theory, but it looks to me as if it's enough to ensure that the government is legally obliged to seek an extension.
And if Brexit is delayed then by the Benn Act, what possible excuse is there then for not having a general election?
Well, I think the reason for not having a general election is that if you want to resolve Brexit and there's a deadlock in Parliament and Parliament can't agree over Brexit and therefore you have to go back to the people to break the deadlock, then a general election, in my view, is the wrong way to decide that, because that's about who is the government of the country. The right way to decide it is to go back not on the general question of who governs, but on the specific question of Brexit.
But the government has no majority or authority. It's no programme it can get through Parliament. It's in office, but it's not in power. I mean, surely any opposition politician would relish an election, a chance to get rid of the government.
Absolutely. And by the way, there's no reason why you shouldn't have an election. That's not my point. My point is don't decide Brexit through it. So there are two separate questions. One is a general election. As you say, the government has run out of steam. And of course, an opposition always wants a general election. And Labour, of course, will want a general election. That's not the issue. It's the point of principle that you shouldn't decide Brexit through that. And you can have a general election, you can have a referendum. They're two separate things.
Let's be honest here. You don't want an election because you think the Tories would win.
I think that there is a real possibility that they win by reason of two things which are not actually to do with Brexit per se. The first is that you will have a split opposition vote. I mean, we have a system really designed for two parties, but you're going to have a three-party contention in this because the Lib Dems are resurgent. Labour and Lib Dems are both polling in the 20s at the moment. So you could have a situation where a Tory government with a majority emerges with 35, 38, even 40% of the vote. They will then claim a mandate, by the way, for no deal, when actually the parties opposed to no deal may have a larger percentage of the vote. So that's a very powerful reason why a general election is wrong in principle.
You don't want an election because you fear the outcome. You want a second referendum because you didn't like the result of the first. What kind of Democrat are you?
I'm a perfectly sensible Democrat.
But one that only likes elections when you win.
No, hang on a minute. If Brexit is the question, right, if that's the reason we're in this mess is Brexit, right? It's not a general question of politics, it's Brexit.
Well, the reason we're in the mess is that this Parliament cannot agree a way forward.
On Brexit.
So have an election.
No, so if Brexit is your problem and Brexit's the question, go back to the people on Brexit. The question actually should be put the other way round to the Boris Johnsons of this world. Why are they worried about asking people specifically whether they want a no-deal Brexit? And the answer to that is they're afraid they lose that. So, yes, of course, I'm worried about a Brexit general election because for the reason I've just given you. You could end up in a situation where, despite a majority of the votes cast for parties that are anti-no deal, the government claims a majority for no deal as a result of the way the electoral system works. And to be honest, look, you're right. There are people who will be opposed to no deal, think that is a risk, but think the election of Jeremy Corbyn is a more substantial risk. But that's not the basis on which we should decide Brexit.
Is it, though? What is a bigger risk to this country, no deal or a Corbyn government?
I think the most immediate risk to this country is a no-deal Brexit. That's my view. But, I mean, I say that, and as I've expressed on many occasions, I have huge reservations about the Corbyn leadership. However, the point that I'm making is, if your problem is Brexit, go back on Brexit.
Except you want a second referendum, but Parliament has voted 4 times against a second referendum.
Yeah. So, but they've also voted against Theresa May's deal, they've voted against the other alternatives, and they've voted against no deal.
So this Parliament can't make up its mind. It knows what it doesn't want. That's clear. It doesn't want to leave on no deal, but it doesn't want a referendum either, a second one. So let's elect a Parliament that can break the logjam. That's the argument.
I know, I mean, you can go around to this in circles, but the fact is, if you've got an election where the principal argument is around Brexit, you're mixing it up with other questions, which are the questions about who governs for the next 5 years, which are a completely different set of questions. And all I'm saying is a very simple point of principle. If your problem is Brexit, and the question's got to go back to the people, put it back to the people in a form that they will understand and vote on the merits of the two respective positions, which are basically no deal or no Brexit.
That would be the question you would want. It would be basically on the ballot paper, no deal or no Brexit.
Well, I think the government, it depends what happens in this next period of time, but I think the government's position is going to be on one side of the ballot paper and Remain is going to be on the other side of the ballot paper. And by the way, you know, people talk about the exact framing of the question. In the end, it's going to be very obvious. If we go back to the people and the people vote to leave again, then that is, frankly, an end of the matter.
But let's just summarise what you're saying here. The public voted to leave in 2016. You want to rerun that. Parliament has voted 4 times against a referendum. You want to ignore that.
I don't want to ignore it. I'm just simply saying in the end, and it's not a rerun, by the way, of 2016. This time, we are going to be taking the decision with the benefit of 3 years of knowledge and experience. It's a decision of this magnitude. After this mess, we will have a clear government position, and I don't think you can argue in June 2016 people really, you can say clearly they voted for no-deal Brexit. You're going back to the people, and I'm not ignoring what Parliament said, I'm simply advocating the sensible solution, if you've got a problem on Brexit, is go back on Brexit.
Well, let's just see if the referendum's even possible, the second one. The Ben Act suggests an extension of our membership until the end of January next year, 2020. That's not long enough to hold a referendum, is it?
Well, it could be, but because
well, it couldn't actually. The Institute for Government said it would take a minimum of 21 weeks
Yes,
for a
I know,
referendum.
but this is all based on the idea that, for example, it takes you 3 months to get through the legislation for a referendum. As Parliament has indicated, you could truncate that enormously. Look, there's no technical reason why you can't have a referendum.
No, but how long would it take, and who would be the government while we waited for the referendum?
The government is the government you're going to have now, and you know that is inevitable, I'm afraid, as a consequence of where we are and where we got to.
This government said it doesn't want another referendum. This Parliament has said it doesn't want another referendum. So how do you get one without a general election?
Well, you get one if Parliament changes its mind or if the government changes its mind. I mean, look, my purpose is not to tell you how you do the parliamentary calculations and get to majority. My purpose is simply to advocate, as I do with MPs of both sides at the moment, and say to them, you're crazy to have a Brexit general election.
But as we waited for this referendum, and it will take some time, we can have an election pretty quickly before Christmas. We couldn't have a referendum by then. Who would be the government while we waited for this referendum?
The government is the government now.
Mr. Johnson will not preside over a government with a referendum. So should the Remain parties back a Corbyn government?
No, look, I don't think you'll get to a caretaker government. But the fact is, leave aside whether you can get to the position I'm advocating. I'm simply advocating it. I mean,
but I'm trying to work. But we could advocate all sorts of things.
No,
I could advocate that we should go to Mars tomorrow, but it probably won't happen. I'm trying to work out how you get.
Somewhat more likely than that.
How you get? Well, you've not given me reasons why it will be.
But I've given you a very solid reason why I think a referendum is much more plausible. Although my principal point is to argue why it's much more rational. But it's much more plausible for this reason, Andrew, that if you look at what is happening in Parliament at the moment, there is complete deadlock, and it is accepted the deadlock's got to be broken by going back to the people. Right. So you go back to the people through an election or a referendum. It's a choice, and all I'm saying is it's better to do it through a referendum.
Would a government of so-called national unity deliver you referendum?
It could do, yes. If the government, for example, refused to abide by the law and they were removed. But I think a government of national unity is rather a long shot.
Who
but
would lead it?
That depends on a consensus emerging in Parliament.
I mean, would it not be remarkable if Mr. Corbyn wasn't asked at least of a first chance at forming one?
Yeah, he might be, but I think he will struggle to get the necessary votes, because there'll be Liberal Democrats and Tory rebels who would not support him. But you only get to that if the government, and frankly, you only get to a government of national unity if the government is trying to avoid implementing the legislation that Parliament's passed. But I don't think they will do that.
Are you not worried that if we headed towards a so-called government of national unity, that many people wouldn't see it as such at all? They would see it as a bunch of Remainer losers forming a government, that those who voted to leave in 2016 have been denied the chance to leave, and here are people that they beat in 2016 now forming a government. I mean, wouldn't that be incendiary?
Well, you're right, it would be extremely controversial, which is why it's better to simply skip over that and go straight to the question of a referendum.
But since Mr. Johnson has vowed to fight another referendum, quote, with every fibre of his body, I still don't see how you get there.
Yeah, I know, but Andrew, he's also said he'll go out on the 31st of October, come what may, but I think he won't. So, look, it's, as I say, we can carry on having the same,
but it's because
same argument.
But because if you believe, as you do, strongly in a second referendum, it is important to then lay out the path to that second referendum. And as I see it so far, I don't see the route.
No, so far, you're right, it hasn't been accepted. But my point is that actually, as people start to go through the alternatives, they're going to understand. And your national unity point is a case in point. If you form the national unity government to have the referendum, why not just have the referendum?
As things stand, though, it looks like we are entering a world in which the choice is fast becoming a really binary one. No deal or no Brexit.
Yeah.
That's a big gamble.
It is a big gamble.
You happy with that gamble?
No, I'm not happy with it, but I think it's the reality, frankly.
But let me just highlight the gamble for you. If there's a general election, Mr. Farage's Brexit party and Mr. Johnson's Tory party will fight separately. If there's a referendum, Mr. Farage and Mr. Johnson will be on the same side. The two most formidable highest profile names in British politics will be on the same side, arguing pretty much for no deal. Who'll lead the Remain campaign?
I don't know. That's going to have to be decided.
You would have no one to match either of them, would you?
Well, I don't know about that. You have to see. I don't know. I'm not going to start chucking out names, but yeah, you'll have to organise.
So that's how big a gamble it is. You haven't even got a leader for you. First of all, we don't know how you'll get to the referendum, and if we do, you don't know who's going to lead your side.
Well, who leads the referendum campaign? I mean, there are prominent people on all the political parties who are opposed to a no-deal Brexit. So I think that leadership will emerge, and it may be that it is a more collective leadership, and perhaps it should be. I don't think there's any harm in that.
How confident are you Remain would win a second referendum?
I believe we'd win, but I agree. It's a very open question.
That's how big a gamble it is?
Yeah, it is a big gamble, but Brexit's a big gamble. To anyone who's studied this, Brexit is not just about Brexit. It's about a whole cultural and economic set of questions that have got to be confronted and dealt with. If you do that, you can reunify the country after a fresh vote. If you don't, you're going to remain very divided. But just remember this, Andrew, if we end up tumbling out of Europe without a deal, and there's been no return to the people on that question, that will also be an incendiary outcome.
Tony Blair, thank you.
Thank you.
Former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and you can watch the long-form version of that interview on this programme's website. We're joined now by our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg. Laura, good to see you again. Everybody's still trying to work out, is there going to be a deal? Is there more chance of one, or is it now a long shot?
I think it's a long shot, is the truth of it. It's not completely impossible. The standard thing that people always say very casually is, oh, well, these things are always done at the last minute. Now, that's easy to say. Of course, this is an extremely complicated political and legal and technical balance of factors that all have to come together at just the right moment. So it's not the case that everyone's been sitting around and leaving it up until the very, very 11th hour. It is still just about possible, but it really is a long shot. There's a crunch meeting tomorrow between the Prime Minister and the Irish leader, Leo Varadkar, the Taoiseach, in the northwest of England. It is possible, if overnight Leo Varadkar has a change of heart and wants to make this happen, it just about could, but it's very difficult to see.
And then it's on to the EU summit, and there's even a question mark, I understand, if there's no chance of a deal, will the British Prime Minister go? But then we have this meeting of Parliament on the 19th, on a Saturday. Hasn't met on a Saturday since the Argentinians invaded the Falklands. Tell us about that.
Super Saturday, as it's already being dubbed. Who knows how super we'll all be feeling by the time we get there. It'll feel like another 100 years in our political lifetimes. You're right, it's not certain that the Prime Minister will go to the summit, but in the immediate aftermath of that meeting of leaders in Brussels, which will take place whether or not he's there, Boris Johnson is expected to summon MPs to Westminster to try to force a decisive moment. Now, as lots of our viewers will know, Parliament's already changed the law to try to make it impossible for him to take us out of the European Union at the end of this month if there hasn't been a deal. But even though that has happened, there is still a belief in the heart of government that they might somehow be able to avoid that. And if they can't avoid it, they want to show in Parliament on that day that they are being dragged, kicking and screaming and protesting into delaying Brexit. And I think what we'll hear on that day is not just the Prime Minister trying to force a vote on what could be a vote on many things. It could be a no deal or delay. It could be no deal or maybe even daring MPs to vote to revoke the whole thing, to say, fine, if you don't want to leave tonight, if you don't want to leave this month, then maybe you're brave enough to give it all up. But I think what we'll definitely hear is lots of very provocative, maybe very audacious political rhetoric from the Prime Minister, who at the end of the day, if he doesn't take us out at the end of October, that is a policy failure for him, but he and his team still at that point would want to use it to try to win the ultimate political war.
Super Saturday.
Super Saturday.
I feel a special coming on. Laura, thank you.
That's right.
Now, Brexit isn't the only game in town this week. Extinction Rebellion protesters have brought Westminster to a standstill with a storm of their own, descending in their thousands on the heart of government, where they plan to see out a full 2 weeks of carefully coordinated disruption, the latest in a worldwide effort to tackle the climate change problem. I'm now joined by Zion Lights. She's a spokesperson for Extinction Rebellion. Welcome. I've seen some of your activists claim on TV that billions of people are going to die in quite short order. One of your founders, Roger Hallam, said in April, our children are going to die in the next 10 to 20 years. What's the scientific basis for these claims?
So these claims have been disputed, admittedly. There are some scientists who are agreeing and there are some who are saying that they're simply not true. But, you know, the overall issue is that these deaths are going to happen. We don't know exact numbers, and actually it's a little bit, you know, concerning to focus on just how many deaths. There will be deaths and mass suffering, and that, you know, any amount is enough as far as we're concerned.
But most scientists don't agree with this. Climate change scientists, those who know there is a problem and it has to be tackled and things have to be done, more has to be done that's being done. I've looked through the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the latest AR5, and the October of last year special report. I see no reference to billions of people going to die or children going to die in under 20 years.
Well, I don't think he was claiming that that was from that report.
No, I know that, but what I'm saying is I don't know where the scientific validity comes for that. I mean,
so there's a lot. How
would they die?
Mass migration around the world is already taking place due to prolonged drought in countries, particularly in South Asia. There are wildfires in Indonesia, the Amazon rainforest, also Siberia, you know, the Arctic.
These are all really important problems, and they can cause fatalities. But they don't cause billions of deaths. They don't mean that our young people will all be dead in 20 years.
No, perhaps not in 20 years, but I can't speak to what Roger was, you know...
He's one of your founders.
With that. He's one of the members of Extinction Rebellion, yes.
I mean, you talk weather-related disasters. There seem to be a lot of them around at the moment, and people die from them. But on the latest figures I've seen, 100 years ago, weather-related disasters killed 500,000 people a year. Today, it's 20,000 a year. Still 20,000 too many, but it's a reduction of 95,000. It doesn't lead to the 95%. A reduction of 95%, it does not lead to a death of billions. I mean, aren't you scaring people with this rhetoric, aren't you?
I think there's a danger of scaring people simply because we're not taking it seriously enough, and people are feeling really, you know, desperate that we're heard on this. And unfortunately, you know, alarmist language works, which is why we're discussing it right now.
But does it work? It could. I mean, I've seen young girls on television, part of your demonstration, particularly the school ones, when they take the day off to demonstrate, crying because they think they're going to die in 5 or 6 years' time.
No, it's not necessarily.
Crying because they don't think they'll ever see adulthood. And yet there is no scientific basis for the claims that your organisation is making.
The young people that I've spoken to aren't crying because they think they're going to die in a few years. It's because they don't see their children as having a future. They don't want to have children. And they're worrying about, you know, coastal regions going underwater, other countries and island nations going underwater, you know, the Maldives going underwater, the mass displacement that's happening, the weather extremes, which may be on a downward trajectory, but climate scientists are telling us that they will be on the increase.
Well, take rising sea levels, because the sea levels are rising. There's no, the UN IPCC makes that quite clear. But even the UN IPCC says that its median projection for sea rising is 0.5 metre by 2100, by 2100, at the end of this century. Now, that will create problems from places from Miami to Bangladesh. But 0.5 metre will not result in billions of people dying. If we do the right thing, it could be managed.
If we do the right thing, but we're not doing much at all at the moment, so this is one of the problems.
But you accept that 0.5 metre would not, if the UN median projection is right, would not result in the sort of apocalyptic predictions that your organisation makes?
They're very conservative numbers, that's what we'd say. And actually, a lot of the data in the IPCC report, not criticising scientists because they did an incredible job, they're using pre-industrial levels of data. They're looking at, carbon emissions. They're not looked at factoring feedback loops, things like this. There are climate scientists saying now that we think it's a lot worse. James Hansen, ex-NASA scientist, is saying we're in a planetary emergency. So we're using that language. We're not trying to use alarmist language. We're listening to what scientists are saying and using language that we feel is appropriate to the situation.
You are losing alarmist language. One of your other founders said that she thought everybody could be dead within several decades. 97% was the figure she put on it. But you want, at the moment, the IPCC policy, the agreed policies to try and cut carbon emissions in half by 2030 and go to zero net emissions by 2050. But you want 2025 for zero emissions, only 6 years away. What would that require?
I mean, I'm not here to give you solutions and to tell you what we should be doing. That's not.
I know you're gumming up the whole of Westminster.
Well, what we're saying is listen to the experts. We're saying listen to the experts. Let's listen to what their ideas are, what they're saying. And at the moment, we're not putting those plans in place. We're not creating policies that reflect what those scientists are saying. This is why we're protesting.
But the experts have a consensus around getting net zero by 2050. You're saying 2025. You're not listening to the experts.
Well, there's some research into the IPCC report that was more recent by Professor Michael Mann, who looked at where they came up with the 2050 figure. And actually, they're relying on a carbon capture, biogas energy storage, BECCS, and there's a problem with that it's an untested technology. And by relying on that, there's a 50-50 chance that we will fail with the 2050 year in place.
You can always pick one piece of research. The fact is the IPCC report has 6,000 scientific references, 91 authors, and is a global consensus with review editors from 40 countries. But let's come back to the 2025 target. One critic has said it would mean the confiscation of petrol cars, state rationing of meat, and limiting families to one flight every 5 years. And that was actually on a 2030 target. Do you agree with that?
I agree that we need to do whatever it takes to bring emissions down, to allow young people to have a future, be able to have some hope for the future. And I'm not saying that because we're alarming children. I'm listening to what they're saying. They're learning about the consequences of climate change at school, and they're worrying about.
Of course, I'm not arguing about the consequences of climate change at all. But you would have to stop to reach your target. You'd have to stop all flying. Aviation would come to an end.
Possibly. I mean,
by 2025.
Again, this is something that we need to look at. We need to look at the aviation industry. We need to do an analysis on what needs to happen, and then we need to take action.
Well, we know what would
on all industries, agriculture, energy, everything.
We know what would happen
to be an expert in these areas.
If we stopped all flying. It would reduce global temperatures using the mainstream climate models by 0.03 degrees. 0.03 degrees. And you would stop all flying for that.
But what you've just said with the IPCC report, we're both in agreement that we listen to that. That's 99% consensus of scientists. That's great. We agree with that. So that report is saying if we don't bring emissions down to halt warming
I understand.
to 1.5 degrees. So aren't we in agreement that we
it's have to? It's the 2025 target, which is the keystone of your policy.
It's the precautionary principle that
just ask you this. Most homes in this country are heated by gas. Most people cook with gas. The fact is, all of that would have to go in 6 years for a 2025 target, wouldn't it? All of it.
We put a man on the moon before we had the internet and mobile phones. We made an international space station. 16 countries worked together to make this and send the parts into space independently using math and assemble it in space. If we really wanted to tackle this emergency, Dr. James Hansen, an ex-NASA scientist, calling it a planetary emergency, Lord Stern...
So no cooking with gas or heating with gas.
But we've had 30 years to think of better solutions, and now is the time to act to bring down those emissions, before it's too late.
Zian Lights, I had more to ask you. I hope you come back, continue the debate. It's an important subject. Thank you for being with us. That's it for tonight. I'll be back here next week at 7 o'clock. See you then.